Hello and welcome to Scholars Hub at Home. I'm Allison Gampel, Associate Director, Alumni Programs at York University. Thank you very much for joining us for today's lecture, Managing for Severe Supply Disruptions, Top Research-Based Tips with Johnny Runtasanatam, Tier 1 Canada Research Chair in Supply Chain Management and Professor of Operations Management and Information Systems at the Schulich School of Business here at York University. It is my responsibility to acknowledge the land that I'm on, but because we are not all gathered in the same place, the land I'm about to acknowledge might not be for the territory you're on. Please take the responsibility to acknowledge the traditional territory you're on. The website nativeland.ca is a good resource for this, and it should appear in the chat. As a member of the York University community, I recognize that many Indigenous nations have long-standing relationships with the territories upon which York University campuses are located that precede the establishment of York University. York University acknowledges its presence on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations. The area known as Takaranto has been caretaken by the Anishinaabeg Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat. It is now home to many First Nation, Inuit, and Métis communities. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This territory is subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. Before we introduce our speaker today, I'd like to give you all a quick university update. Earlier this year, York released a dynamic new report website documenting our progress towards the United Nations 17 Sustainable Development Goals. The UN Sustainable Development Goal Report is York's first annual progress report on the SDGs, and both the report and the accompanying website highlight York's leadership, commitment, and progress toward the 17 goals through inspirational stories, facts, and figures, and forward-looking action. It's inspiring to see all the actions being taken towards creating positive change, and I encourage you all to view the report and website at yorku.ca/UN-SDGs, which should also appear in your chat. Now, as you may know, we like to conduct a quick poll before each lecture. So today, the question that we're asking is, how would you rate your knowledge regarding the topic of today's presentation? So the poll should pop up on your screen. I see it has. I'll give everyone a moment to respond. Thank you. It's always helpful for our speaker to have a sense of who's in our audience and their level of knowledge of the topic. Most of us are used to Zoom by now, but if you do need help, feel free to click at any time on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and enter a question. We've got a team in the background that's ready to help you. That same button can be used to submit questions for our guest speakers to answer during the Q&A period that will follow today's presentation. If you write them in there, I'll read them out and ask them of our guest speaker. Please do note that all of your questions and comments are visible to both our panelists and staff working behind the scenes, so please keep your comments relevant and respectful. On to today's talk. Today we are featuring Johnny Runtasanatam. Dr. Runtasanatam is a fellow inductee of the Decision Sciences Institute and is considered one of the top 50 authors of operations and supply chain management research related to quality management, mass customization, and supply chain disruptions and relationships. His current research focuses on attributes, triggering events, performance consequences, and mitigation of supply disruptions. His research interests lie in corporate social responsibility, cross-cultural management, business ethics and ethical decision-making, organizational justice, and strategic human resources management. We are so pleased, Dr. Runtasanatam, that you could make it and be with us today. And I'd like to invite you to turn on your camera and share your screen and share your wisdom with our community. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you very much for that wonderful introduction and a virtual welcome to everybody in attendance. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And I'm hoping that everybody is able to follow along. Again, if you have questions, feel free to post them to the chat box, and if I can answer them at the moment, I will. If not, then I will answer them towards the end. Our topic for today is managing for, and I'm going to stop at the word for, and everybody make an emphasis, for severe supply disruptions. And I'm going to provide you with some research-based tips from the last 20 years of work that I've been doing in this area. I want to first start by thanking my host, okay, for this opportunity to share, what I've been working on, and hopefully help all of us understand what we need to do to basically minimize severe consequences from being disrupted in the supply. My agenda for the day, okay, two questions, okay? We're going to talk about what is a supply disruption, and we're going to talk about what is a supply disruption trigger, and I'm going to go right into top tips. There are more than the 5 that I'm going to talk about, but given the time constraint, okay, we'll just stick to the 5 that I'm going to share with you today. And if you have questions, feel free to reach out to me afterwards. But before I begin, I stopped at the word for a very specific reason. And the reason is because when you manage for something, okay, it means that you are actually anticipating that something, okay, as opposed to managing the object itself. The reason I went with emphasis on for is because supply disruptions are unavoidable. Murphy's law comes into play, in the sense that what can go wrong will go wrong. I said the same thing in 2007 in an article when I said all supply chains are inherently risky. Why? Because all supply chains will experience sooner or later some event that will disrupt the normal flow of goods and materials. Well, that message didn't stick or did not become top of mind, because in 2014, okay, we come back and actually make the same point. Okay, supply disruptions are a matter of when, not if. 2014 Supply Chain Resilience Survey report note that 81% of businesses experienced at least one disruption in the prior year. Why unavoidable? What was true back then is even truer today, because supply chains today are actually increasingly vulnerable. Why? Because we are sourcing globally, our sourcing activities are complex, and there are multiple handoffs in this chain that is bringing goods and services ultimately into the hands of the consumers. These chains are very long, and there's very limited visibility. A Deloitte 2018 survey made this point very clear when it said that 65% of the procurement leaders from 39 countries that they surveyed only have visibility to tier 1 suppliers. And that means just one level up from where they are in terms of their position in the supply chain. So what is then a supply disruption? Knowing that, the point I make, forget about avoiding supply disruption. It's going to happen, right? So what is it then that we need to understand about supply disruption itself and the triggers, or what I call the causes of supply disruption? Well, let me give you an answer from an IBM commercial. And this is an old commercial, okay? And the actual closed caption version of this is in this link, okay? I have a downloaded version, which I'm going to share with you.
Where are my socks? If I don't get those socks, I'm out of business.
Did you check all your stocks?
There's no socks in my stocks.
Check down by the docks.
I'm the box. There's no socks.
I've checked every box. There's no box full of socks. Forget about socks. I just saw folks. We got locks. We got frocks.
Not frocks, not walks, not locks, just socks.
You've got your clocks.
Supply chain problems? IBM?
Okay. So this is an old commercial selling IBM consulting services to help companies manage supply chains. Back then, we weren't talking about supply chains. We were just talking about how to make sure that goods are where they need to be. In this video, in this commercial, you have a retail store that sells socks, and the proprietor, retail manager, is unable to locate where her socks are, the socks that she's selling to the public. So when you think about what is a supply chain, more formally, okay, this is a typical picture of what a supply chain looks like for a company, which we will generically call Z. Okay, so you have flow of goods coming into Z, and then you have flow of goods going out of Z. When I talk about supply disruption, I'm talking about an interruption in the planned physical flow of goods or services from the supply base anywhere upstream that then affects Z's ability to actually perform its own planned activities. So an interruption in the flow of goods from a supplier to you might affect your ability to actually produce goods downstream to fulfill orders from the warehouse or the distribution and ultimately in a marketplace. So the interruption in this physical flow means that things may not be flowing from a first-tier supplier to you. Things may not be flowing between first-tier suppliers. Things may not be flowing from a second-tier supplier to a first-tier supplier that ultimately affects the first-tier supplier to actually send goods to you. So when this happens, you, the company Z, will face ambiguity with respect to when am I going to actually get the order timing, how much am I going to actually get in terms of order quantity, or both. And when you face this ambiguity, you then are unable to fulfill what I call the right 6 goal, right? And the goal, simply stated, means that your organization is supposed to provide the right level of quality to the right customer in the right quantity at the right place, right time, at the right cost, if you're in accounting, right price if you're marketing. So if you're not able to provide products and services that fulfill these right 6, you have been disrupted. Now, of course, what we must also understand that is that not every interruption in physical flow upstream from your supply in supply base ends up causing you, Z, to not be able to produce and satisfy demand downstream. So for example, if I have buffer inventory or excess capacity that allows me to withstand any interruptions in my supply base so that there's enough time for your supply base to recover, then you, Z, will actually not face disruption. You, Z, will still continue to fulfill the demand that you see from your warehouses, from your distribution centers, from the retail stores in the marketplace. So if you understand that supply disruption is actually a change in the planned flow rate, okay, change in the planned flow rate, then what then is a supply disruption trigger? Well, simply put, let me give you examples. 1997, okay, Aisin is a plant that makes P-valves and other brake parts for Toyota. A fire occurs at that plant and therefore stops production of the P-valves at Aisin plant. Toyota main assembly plants shut down. 2006, Prevent Group supplies the covers for the seats as well as the transmission parts to Volkswagen. Labor issue, Prevent Group is unable to actually send the seat covers to Volkswagen. 6 Volkswagen plants stop work. In the early days of the pandemic, right, in 2020, we talked about coronavirus, the COVID-19 virus, creating a toilet paper shortage. Why? Because consumers changed their consumption pattern. They were buying toilet paper for whatever reason, okay, for fear of not having toilet paper, causing shelves to be empty. Then, of course, we saw the incident in 2021 where a large ship actually blocked the Suez Canal passage, which then diverted cargo from going through the Suez Canal around the Cape of Africa, the South of Africa, to actually send goods to where they need to go. Then, of course, late last year, okay, we had the flooding, the weather situation in British Columbia that shut down the roads, rail, the Port of Vancouver, which then delayed goods from flowing through the Port of Vancouver to reach other parts of Canada. Then, most recently, we have the Freedom Convoy shutting down the ports of entry in Canada, which also interrupt the flow of goods into Canada, as well as the flow of goods out of Canada into the US. So these are examples of what I call disruption, supply disruption triggers. Any event which actually changes the flow of goods from plan is a trigger. So with that, understanding of what is the supply disruption. Now, you might ask me, why do I want to make this distinction? Well, the reason is actually quite simple, because in the public media, we tend to confuse the two. And the tips I'm going to provide actually will speak to how do you manage for supply disruption as it's unfolding, and how do you actually manage for triggers that cause those interruptions. So let's dive into our tips. Tip number one is what I call the adapt capabilities, right? AD square root to APT. The adapt capabilities refer to six very specific capabilities that organizations need to possess in order to manage for the eventuality of being disrupted. And the six capabilities include ability to track triggers that are known, ability to anticipate a disruption occurring, as well as the occurrence of the trigger itself, ability to detect when actually things have gone wrong, ability to diagnose what's causing the situation to be unfolding that's causing flow to be disrupted, ability to activate resources that allow you to address the challenges that you're facing quickly, and then last but not least, ability to protect future reoccurrences of the trigger. So this is the basis of a paper that my colleagues and I are actually preparing for Sloan Management Review, where we highlight how these capabilities can be useful for managing in a systematic manner supply disruptions in the future, and hopefully avoid being disrupted. Tip number two, okay? In the early days of the pandemic, the World Economic Forum talked about how supply chains can become more resilient in this case being avoiding being disrupted as well as quickly getting back to normal. And they talked about visibility into the supply chains. Well, this point was actually made much earlier in 2007 by my colleague, Robert Hanfield, where he talked about visibility systems. And likewise, in the same article, 2007, that I published, where we talked about the importance of investing in warning systems that have both human and IT capabilities. And what do I mean by this? These are warning systems that actually alert organizations to impending danger. Tip number three, okay, and this is based on a forthcoming article based on research that I had done with retail stores looking at how to reduce inventory shrink, okay? And what we found is that if you are able to increase sensing, ability of employees to sense, okay, breaches in retail store operations, retail stores should be able to save approximately $8 million in shrink at what we call average levels of centralization and formalization. So what do I mean by this, right? Very specifically, if store employees are always alert and are able to sense what we call weak security breach signals. Yeah. Weak security breach may be the potential for someone to actually steal from the store, whether it's a customer or employee theft, then you are able to then reduce the losses from inventory shrinkage, right? Whether it's being stolen or whether it's being pilfered. So what we also note in this particular piece of research is that the more you centralize decision-making, the worse of it is, even when you have sensing capability. So imagine if your employees are actually trained, indoctrinated to be alert to any anomalies in their day-to-day work routines. If every time they sense something going wrong and they have to go through multiple layers of authorization for them to act, you can imagine that by the time they act, that event, that security breach, that potential customer shoplifting would have already occurred. So what with this research finds is that not only must you develop the sensing capability, but you also must give the frontline employees some authority to act very quickly in the event of a danger that poses a threat to normal operations. So why call this the Spidey's danger sense? There is a need to actually develop the sensing capability employees, especially when they are in critical positions through training, and at the same time, decentralize some of the decision-making so that they can react faster. My Spidey danger sense. Tip number 4, okay, is how do you actually get your supply base to actually help you? right? And this is a paper that's actually under review at a journal where we advise firms, organizations to build strong connections with the supply base. In other words, treat your supply base as part of your family, as opposed to just a transaction. And use these connections to help you source data information that allows you to track and detect supply disruption triggers and flow interruptions. Okay. And so the strength that of your connections with the supply base, plus an IT capability that allows you to link data between you and your supply base, will actually enhance your ability to detect. And this ability to detect then actually helps with turning your inventory. In this case, we're talking about economic profit. Helps you to sell what you sell faster. Tip number 4. Tip number 5, okay, has to do with something that maybe firms need to rethink, right? We all know that firms need to innovate, right? This has been a hallmark of Apple, and this has been a hallmark of companies such as 3M. We need to innovate to provide new products, to provide new versions of existing models to the customers. But over innovating actually increases the susceptibility of organizations to severe supply disruptions. So I have a piece of ongoing research that is forthcoming in National Journal of Production Research, where we show that when firms innovate a lot, okay, they actually increase their dependence on the suppliers. They also create complexity because they now manage a lot of products. And both of these in turn increase the risk of the organization being disrupted. So how do you actually counter the fact that you have no choice but to innovate to survive? Okay, and at the same time, you're going to actually face higher disruption risk. Well, we actually suggest 2 mechanisms where organizations can implement or develop in order to counter the need to innovate. One is similar to the comment about working with your supply base. There has to be some way to gather knowledge about what's happening in the outside environment, in your supply base, in the political situation, in the customers, in the demand space, to help you, okay, mitigate or reduce the severity of complexity and increase the supply base that you face. The other is that you need to be in a much stronger position relative to the suppliers that you'll be depending on. So for this article, based on this article, what we are suggesting is that innovate, but, right? The tip is innovate, but at the same time, make sure that you strengthen your importance in the supply network and make sure that you actually have the capability to find and use knowledge that's outside the organization so that you reduce the risks you face from being disrupted. The last tip, I said I'm going to give you 5. I'm actually going to give you the last one, which is a teaser. And the reason why it's a teaser is because this is based on one ongoing project. Okay, we're looking at the composition of top management teams and how they react to supply disruptions. And the graph that I'm showing you, okay, has an insight as relates to what composition, how the top management team should be composed, right? So on my x-axis, I have what's called percentage of female members that make up the top management team. On my y-axis, it's the likelihood that you're going to actually do something when your supply is being disrupted. And what the curve shows that as the percentage of female members increase in the top management team, the more likely you're not going to sit back and just wait for things to resolve themselves. So when you face a disruption, the more female members you have on your top management team, the more likely you're going to actually take some action in response to being disrupted. But there is a threshold level, there is a peak, at least based on our data, where it seems to be around 50%, right? Where if your top management team has 50% females, then you are actually have a higher probability of reacting. But as you increase the number of female members on your top management team, then the reacting actually starts going down. As a corollary to this research finding that we are working on, there's also information related to family members and non-family members that make up the top management team. And what we noticed that female non-members, the more you have of female non-members on top management team, the better. The greater the chance that you will not sit back and wait for things to resolve themselves. You actually take action to make sure that you can get back to normal faster. So as I said, this is a teaser. It has to deal with top management team diversity. And what we're saying that the more females you have in top management roles, the better you are, the more likely you are to actually take some action when you face a supply disruption. So given our time constraint, what are my takeaways, right? One, we need to all understand that supply disruptions are inevitable, okay? No company, no organization will be forever immune to being disrupted. It is not a question of whether or not, but a question of when they will occur and how severe your organization, your company is going to actually suffer when they do occur. Two, in the midst of supply disruptions, when you're trying to get your physical flow of goods back to normal, the focus should be on getting the flow of goods back to normal or as close as possible. Worry about why it happened, who is responsible, what caused it later. So this is like when you go to an ER, when patients go into an ER situation. ER doctors don't look for the cause yet. They first stabilize the patient. Then they send the patient to other units where they try and figure out why did the patient come into the ER in the first place. Same point I'm trying to make. In the midst of a supply disruption, when you are facing a supply disruption, focus on getting back to normal, getting the physical flow to be as close as possible to the planned flow. Then go and find the blame and fix the blame later. Three, there are many tips, some which seem intuitive, but they bear repeating, that are out there for how you manage for supply disruptions, especially manage such that you will not suffer in a disastrous manner from supply disruptions that occur. But these tips are conscious investments. Sometimes these investments do not have a very short return on investment. The return on investment actually comes when you find that you have avoided a disastrous outcome because you have been disrupted. And these investments include developing human capabilities, IT capabilities, and managerial capabilities. So with that, I'm open to questions that you might have.
Thank you very much, Professor. It was really, really interesting, and I'm glad to know that my gender is playing a role in helping to minimize supply chain issues. That was a really great teaser. I can't wait to learn more. Really appreciate you sharing your insight and your research with us. To our audience, if you have questions, already one has come in, but as you're thinking of questions, please use the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen to write in your question, and I will ask it on your behalf. If we have any friends who are watching on Facebook, you're welcome to submit any questions or comments in the comment section for the video, and those will be sent my way. Okay, so let's start with the first question that comes from our audience, from Danielle. Thanks, Danielle, for sending our first question. Danielle asks, if a disruption is what affects ability to deliver to plan, are there other supply disruption problems that happen when the plan is no longer in sync with demand? Should part of the solution be to first determine if the plan is still optimal?
Okay. Great question, Danielle. Thank you for asking the question. So recall that a disruption is actually the flow being interrupted. And flow being interrupted is let's make this a little more concrete. Suppose you expect the supplier to send you 100 units of ketchup, 100 bottles of ketchup. A disruption means that you're only getting 50 instead of 100. A disruption means that you wanted 100 bottles of ketchup today, but it's actually showing up tomorrow, or it's showing up yesterday. It showed up yesterday. That is also a supply disruption. And why is showing up yesterday a supply disruption? Because you built your system your organization such that it's supposed to show up today and you weren't home yesterday, right? So when we talk about supply disruption, we're talking about the flow not being what you planned for. So when you talked about a plan that is no longer in sync, and therefore you're not actually supplying the flow, that is the plan causing the interruption in flow. And when would that happen? Happens all the time, right? It happens when we anticipate what the consumers want incorrectly. Think about, the toilet paper. It wasn't that the toilet paper is no longer available. It's just that because of the fear and the hoarding, customers were actually demanding toilet paper at a much higher volume. And where were the toilet papers that we had? Well, they were being stocked in locations that were meant to supply huge organizations, the hotels and the restaurants and the universities and the companies. They weren't being positioned to have someone buy, 1 row, 2 rows in the retail stores, right? So that was the plan incorrect? Yes, it was incorrect because it didn't anticipate that coronavirus, COVID-19 is going to cause panic buying, and therefore it didn't position the toilet paper in the retail stores. But you notice that was short-lived, right? Because organizations, retail stores like Loblaws, Home Depot, Walmart, they were quickly able to then shift the toilet paper from where they were positioned to be selling to organizations and put them in the retail stores. So if organizations are doing their demand forecasting, demand planning correctly, then, and remember what I said about being able to anticipate and track and actually know and have information about what may potentially be going wrong in the next month, next 3 months, next 6 months, they could build the plan in such a way that they can react faster. Right? The only time when the plan is definitely at fault is when, and this has to do with the fact that bullwhips are no longer in high demand. Back when the automobile became the means of travel, and everybody still thought that we need, carriages and bullwhips, and the bullwhip market died. That would be the only situation when plans are actually wrong because the plan was for a product that nobody wants anymore.
Thank you for that. The next question that I'm going to ask is coming from Rose in our Q&A, and Rose asks, can you comment on current world sanctions on Russia and who will be most affected? Thanks.
Everybody's going to be affected, right? So Russian society, the consumers, they're going to be affected because there's no means for them to actually trade, okay? But now imagine Russian being sanctioned and not being able to fly goods in there, it's actually cutting a pathway for China and the goods that actually come out of the western portion of China through Europe, right? And ultimately, consumers, society, the European community will be affected. When they're affected and we buy stuff from them, we're going to be affected. Not only is it already affecting energy prices, okay? So this is not a good situation, okay? And the sooner they can resolve the disputes and differences, the better, the faster we can get back to normal. Last year, late in last year, I was asked a question, oh, when are we going to get back to normal with COVID-19? And I said, if I had a crystal ball, okay, I had a crystal ball and I can predict, perfectly, I would say as long as nothing else happens in the world, then maybe by summer. But every incident that creates a shock to the movement of goods is going to delay how quickly we can get back to normal. I didn't see Freedom Convoy coming. If I saw Freedom Convoy coming, then maybe we could have put some policies, blocking and tackling in place so that we didn't have the landed port of entries being shut down for the days that we saw. Right? So this is what I mean by it's inevitable. Supply disruption are going to be inevitable. It's really how much hurt you will feel when it happens. And if you follow some of the tips that I mentioned, then at least the suffering will be short-lived.
Right. There's another question that's coming in from John about another similar situation. And John is asking, how would you grade the reaction to the Suez blockage, given how long the physical situation has existed?
Yeah.
Thoughts on that?
Sure. We're dealing with physics in this case, right? Or oceanography, right? You have a ship that for some reason has turned around and pretty much blocked other ships from flowing through, right? And it required, some means to actually shift the position of the ship, and that takes time. But then in the background, when you look at what was happening in the news, there were discussions like, who's at fault? Was the captain asleep at the helm? Which country owned that ship? Interesting, sensational discussion points, but irrelevant to, hey, what do we need to do to make sure that we can turn the ship in such a way that other ships can pass by, or it can then move through the canal so that other ships can get by. And that's what I mean when in my second takeaway, when you are facing an interruption, in this case, when Suez Canal says that, oh my God, goodness, okay, other ships cannot pass, the first point of attack, or the first, bad word, choice of word today, the first focus should be, hey, what do we need to do to get the ship positioned so they can flow through? Not who should we send a fine to? Not, is this a criminal act? Not any of these other issues that were part of the news cycle when this is happening.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, so the next question is coming from Ron, who brings us back to the early days of COVID. And we saw a shortage of personal protective equipment in hospitals and healthcare facilities in those early stages of COVID. What can healthcare leaders do better for planning?
So let's talk about healthcare leaders in terms of these actual administrative units, the hospitals and the health systems, right? What can they do? Well, the answer is that you need to stock up, right? But it's not just healthcare leaders that run these operations, right? Because anytime you invest in safety stock, costs you money. Okay, money that you could then perhaps invest in other endeavors to make the delivery care better. So it involves not only the private sector, but the public sector, the governments, right? So this is where the provincial government, Ontario government was actually trying to do the same thing. The federal government had the same act. They were acting correctly. They actually had stockpile. But the problem with the stockpile PPE was that nobody was checking on a regular basis. And so the PPE expired right before the surge in demand for PPE equipment. So and this is typical of governments. Every time you change, we lose sight of things that we have enacted, right? So the government is already now reinvesting in capacity, inventory of critical items. I don't know whether I'm a US citizen, so I listened to the Biden, State of Union talk to that. I mean, even in the US, they're talking about we need to make sure that we stockpile. We bring some of the work back that of the critical things that are important in times of crisis, right? What the government did, okay, is they immediately, back in the early days, okay, knowing the situation in PPE is that they didn't really just, take no action. And maybe it's because they were female members in the cabinet, right? So they did exactly what we talked about, which is they needed to act. And what did they do? They bought, right? They bought overseas, but then they had trouble getting the shipments because the US being the bully, commanding a lot of that. But they also asked for help from the private sector. How many companies in the private sector switched their production, from making, Canada Goods coats to making PPE, to making masks, right? So it wasn't the government not acting. It takes time to retrofit production processes. But other than the government doing what it's doing, stockpiling PPE on behalf of society, healthcare administrators also need to think about stockpiling some of these items because you're preparing for that emergency situation. It's not just the bottom line that we need to care about. So.
Thank you. I want to ask a question. There's no more questions coming into the chat, so I'll ask one that's on my mind. I was really lucky and filled my car with gas 2 nights ago. But yesterday, when I went to the pump, I saw that there was a huge line because, there's, I guess they announced an 11-cent increase on price. Can you speak about the supply issues as it pertains to gas?
Well, the no gas situation partly is because of the situation with Ukraine and Russia. I've already said that energy issues are being affected. But more importantly, we need to talk about inflation, right? Because you mentioned that the gas price has gone up, and in December, I actually talked to Bloomberg on this very issue, right? So if all things are going proceeding as normal, goods are flowing as normal, that means that the expected profit point or price point, okay, is relatively stable, right? So anytime you have to take action to react, to expedite, right, to find new ways to get goods to customers, somebody has to pay. Companies might say we'll absorb some of the costs and actually pass just a small fraction to consumers. Some companies might say we're going to pass an entire cost increase to consumers. So the 11 cents that you saw in your gas price could be either shared between the refineries and the distributors, or they pass completely on to you. Don't know, right, at this point. But what is to be expected is that anytime you have an interruption in the physical flow of goods, the cost is going to go up. But what's compounding the situation globally today is what I call easy money, out of necessity, right? So when COVID-19 hit, pretty much all governments around the world said that, oh, people are not going to be able to work, they're not going to pay the bills. What do? Well, we print money, we give money, right? And in the short term, it seems like we are actually helping society, but the long-term consequences is that it makes the borrowing of money more expensive. And therefore, it's putting inflationary pressure on the goods that we are selling. So you got two situations. You got government policies for loose money, and then you got actual cost increase that's affecting the inflation rate. So I see in the chat box 2 questions. Danielle, you had a follow-up question on sometimes the solution is absolutely, right? And that's what I mean by public sector, partnerships. I'm new to Canada, so I understand that private sector government partnerships is not as welcome as in other countries, but it's something that we definitely must consider, right? There's certain investments that must be made in order to protect society against crises that cannot be borne out by the private sector. Think about the vaccine production, right? Early in the days of the COVID-19, Canada does not have a vaccine manufacturing facility. I understand that there were plans to build one, it was scrapped, and now it's back on the table, right? And the reason is because we now realize that we cannot rely on our friendly neighbor to the south to actually be there to provide us with a vaccine or elsewhere. So building a vaccine manufacturing facility is a very, very large investment that private sector likely do not want to go into by them. Private sector companies are not likely to want to do that by themselves. So either there's a consortium or the government actually has to come into play. Same thing with infrastructure. I believe in Canada, your infrastructure problem actually has a provincial versus a government, sort of a perspective, just like in the US as well, right? If you want the infrastructure to be resilient and robust, okay, then yeah, investments have to be made and it has to be borne out. It has been made by the governments, but ultimately we as members of, living in the country, we must understand that our taxes will have to go up. So there's no free lunch, right? If we want something that private sector cannot provide in a profitable manner and the government has to step in, we must be willing to foot some of the bill. So Rose, Frito-Lay chips and Loblaws. Okay, I'm not exactly sure what you're referring to. Could you maybe elaborate on this?
I can elaborate on it. I think that we recently learned that Frito-Lay, which is a brand owned by PepsiCo Canada, stopped selling to Loblaws after the retailer refused requests by Frito-Lay to increase their prices. And so wondering what impact does this have on the supply chain flow for them, for other big chains? And this is going to unfortunately be our last question.
Oh, okay. So yeah, I can talk forever. This is a great conversation, right? So for the consumer, What does that mean? No more Frito-Lay products, okay, at Loblaw stores. But, Loblaw will likely find some substitute, okay, to fill those shelf spaces. Now, did Loblaws do a good thing by refusing to actually increase the prices? That will be, I think, a judgment call on everybody's part, okay? For me, a chip is a chip. Okay, if I don't have the Frito-Lay chip, I find another chip to satisfy my salty, the demand for a salty snack. Now, if Frito-Lay had agreed to the price and actually passed the price increase to you, to the consumer, how would you react? Right. So it seems like from a quantity perspective, I'm not getting my goods, but that's assuming that we're paying the same price rate. What if I'm getting goods by a much higher price? These are complex consumer buying issues, and maybe for future Scholars Hub can actually bring in a consumer behavior person. I can suggest one to talk about these issues. Right? It's complex, right? And it's confounded by the fact that we as individuals have our own preferences on a lot of these matters. So.
Perfect. Well, thank you for all of your insight and sharing and answering so many of our questions. And definitely we'll look for your recommendations for a topic on consumer behavior. That would be a really interesting topic to cover as well, and a nice add-on. But it's been an absolute joy to have you, to host you, and to learn more about what you do and get your responses to how supply chain is being affected sort of in our day-to-day lives with everything going on in the world. So we are very, very grateful that you're here, and want to thank you.
Thank you very much for the opportunity, and feel free to reach out and contact me as the audience, the members of the audience feel fit. So. Wonderful.
Thank you. Well, at this point, you can say goodbye and turn off your camera, and I'm just going to conclude our session. Thank you so much. So for our audience members, if you would like to share today's session with families and friends, it will be posted to our YouTube page, youtube.com/YorkU alumni. And you can also watch past lectures that you may have missed. At this point, we would like to ask you an additional poll question, which is, how would you rate your knowledge of today's topic following the discussion? So it should pop up on your screen. There it is. I'll give you a moment to respond. Okay, thank you for taking the time to respond. It's always helpful for us to know how much you learned. I know I certainly learned a lot, and I'm very grateful to the professor for being here. As I wrap up, I'd like to just share an important announcement, which is that in response to enactment of the Emergency Powers Act for the Ottawa protests and border blockades, we've added a session to the Scholars Hub schedule, and it is titled Law in the Time of COVID, Pandemics, Protests, and Emergencies, and it will feature Osgoode Hall, which is our law school, Professor Alan Hutchison. This is happening tomorrow at noon, and the registration link, I think, just appeared in the chat. So should you wish to join us for this timely lecture and discussion, I invite you to register and join us tomorrow. We return to our regular schedule on Wednesday, March 16th with Dr. Cora Young, Associate Professor from the Department of Chemistry, and her session is titled, Do Clear Skies Mean Clean Air? Pandemic Lockdowns and Their Influence on Air Quality. And then again on Wednesday, May 30th, we will have Assistant Professor Emily Laxer from the Department of Sociology at Glendon College with her session, Populism, Legality, and the Politics of Diversity in Canada. So as always, register for these events and learn more at yorku.ca/alumni and friends. It's going to appear in the chat as well. So without further ado, we hope to see you tomorrow, and we thank you for being here today, and take care, be well.